They thought the couple ran off together, until a hidden letter found after 29 years proved the dust motes danced in the slivers of moonlight, a silent ballet in the attic's stale air. For 29 years, they had been the only witnesses. They settled on forgotten furniture draped in white shrouds, on boxes sagging with the weight of time, and on the small, unassuming wooden chest tucked away in the darkest corner beneath the eaves. It was the kind of chest a child might keep, for treasures, pirate maps, and polished stones. But this one held a different kind of map, a different kind of treasure. It held the truth. Downstairs, the house was hollowed out, stripped of its life. The carpets were rolled, the walls bare, the windows staring out like vacant eyes. Sarah, her face etched with a grief too old for her 43 years, ran a hand over a water-stained patch on the living room wall. Her mother was gone. The funeral had been 3 days ago, a quiet, somber affair for a woman who had lived a quiet, somber life. Now came the final brutal task, dismantling a home, piece by painful piece. Her brother, Mark, a man whose shoulders seemed permanently stooped by an unspoken burden, called from the hallway. "Anything up there?" "Just dust and ghosts," Sarah called back, her voice thin. She didn't want to go up there. The attic had always been her father's domain, a place of stern warnings and locked doors. Even after he'd died, her mother had kept it sealed, as if honoring a sacred pact. But the estate agent was coming tomorrow, and everything had to be cleared. With a sigh that seemed to stir the very dust around her, Sarah pulled down the rickety folding ladder. The air that met her was thick, smelling of decaying paper, cedar, and something else. Something faintly, cloyingly sweet, like old perfume or dried flowers. She climbed, her sneakers squeaking on the wooden rungs, and hoisted herself into the oppressive heat of the attic. The moonlight cut sharp lines across the floor, illuminating a graveyard of memories. There was her old tricycle, its red paint, chipped and faded. A stack of her father's law books, their leather covers cracked, and in the corner, almost hidden behind a ghostly shrouded armchair, was the chest. It wasn't locked. The small brass latch was tarnished but unfixed. Curiosity, a feeling she hadn't truly felt in years, pricked at her. It was so out of place. Her father, a man of locks and keys, of secrets and safes, had left this one thing open. She knelt, the floorboards groaning in protest, and lifted the heavy lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of yellowed lace, was a single sealed envelope. It was made of thick, creamy parchment, the kind reserved for wedding invitations or declarations of love. But the name on the front was not her mother's. It was written in a looping, elegant script that Sarah recognized instantly, a jolt going through her like a current. For Elara. Elara. The name was a ghost on her tongue, a forbidden word. Her father's younger sister, the beautiful, wild aunt she had never known. The aunt who had vanished without a trace when Sarah was just a teenager. The official story, the one whispered at tense family gatherings and then buried under decades of silence, was that Ilara had run off with her lover, a boy from the wrong side of the tracks, named Liam. They were two reckless souls, chasing a dream of freedom, leaving behind a trail of broken hearts and unanswered questions. But this letter felt different. It felt heavy, not with dreams, but with secrets. Her fingers trembled as she broke the wax seal, a small, perfect rose imprinted in the crimson. The paper inside was brittle, the ink faded to a soft brown. She unfolded it carefully, the crease whispering open like a last breath. The first words stole the air from her lungs. By dearest Ilara, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and the monster who took you from me has finally paid his price. Forgive me for my silence. Forgive me for my cowardice. I was a boy, and he was a king in this small, cruel town. A king who wore a badge and a smile, but whose castle was built on fear. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. This wasn't a love letter from Liam. The handwriting was different. It was tight, controlled, as if written by a hand trying to suppress a tremor. He told everyone, you ran away. He made it so easy to believe. You were the wild one, the girl with. starlight in her eyes, and rebellion in her heart. And Liam loved you enough to be your scapegoat, but they didn't run. He took you. He took you both. I saw it. I was there, hidden in the shadows of the old quarry, the place we all used to go to feel free. I saw his car, the official seal of the town's police department, gleaming on the door. I saw Sheriff Thompson drag Liam from his truck. He didn't fight, he just looked at your window, his face a mask of hopeless love. Then the sheriff went for you. You fought Ilara. My God, how you fought! Your screams, they echo in my nightmares still. I heard the thud, the sickening crack, and then, silence. He put you in the trunk of his cruiser, both of you. He drove away, leaving Liam's truck parked by the Lover's Leap, a perfect stage. For his perfect story, Sarah's vision blurred. The dust motes swam, the moonlight warped. Sheriff Thompson, Old Man Thompson, the man who had given her candy when she was a child, who had patted her on the head and called her Sweet Pea. The man who had personally overseen the investigation into Ilara and Liam's disappearance. His face a portrait of paternal concern on the local news. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, but I was 17, and he was the law. He was a god in this town. He'd visited our farm a week before, talking to my father about property lines, but his eyes were on you. He warned my father you were trouble, that you were corrupting the decent folk. He was obsessed. He owned the judges, the mayor, everyone. To speak against him was to sign your own death warrant. My father knew it. He grabbed me when I tried to run out, his hand like a vice on my arm, his face pale with terror. You saw nothing, he'd whispered, his voice shaking. You were here, with me, all night. Do you understand me, son? You saw nothing, so I saw nothing. I let him bury you. I let him bury you both out there, in the God-forsaken woods past the quarry, in a place no one ever goes. I watched a good man, Liam, be branded a coward and a kidnapper. I watched your family grieve for a girl who ran away, not a girl who was stolen. And I have lived with the silence, a cancer in my soul, for every day of my miserable life. I know now that my silence was a second murder. I have kept this letter, a confession of my own damnation, hidden away. I told myself I would release it when he was dead, when his power could no longer hurt my family. But he has outlived me. He is old now, a respected town elder, his hands washed clean by time, but the blood is still there. It is on his hands, and it is on mine. This letter is my only hope for redemption. It is a map. In the back of this chest, beneath the false bottom, you will find a diagram. It leads to the place he puts you. Don't let him win, Ilara. Don't let him die a hero. Let the world know what he is. Let them know what he did to you, to the boy who loved you, and to the boy who was too afraid to save you. Yours in eternal shame, Thomas Miller. Thomas Miller. The name hit Sarah with the force of a physical blow. The Millers owned the farm that bordered her family's property. Tommy Miller. He had been a quiet, haunted-looking boy, a few years older than her. He'd died of a heart attack a decade ago, a man who had barely lived, his life a long, slow fade into obscurity. Her hands shook so violently she could barely hold the paper. A false bottom, with trembling fingers, she felt along the inside of the chest. Her nails scraped against a thin line in the wood. She pried it up. It came away with a soft groan, revealing a shallow compartment beneath. Inside was another piece of paper, a hand-drawn map, sketched on the back of a feed store receipt. It was a crude drawing of the old quarry, with an X marked deep in the woods that bordered it. Beside the map was a small, tarnished silver locket. Sarah opened it. On one side was a tiny faded photograph of her Aunt Ilara, her smile radiant, her eyes full of defiant joy. On the other side was a picture of a handsome young man with dark, brooding eyes and a shy smile. Liam, and entwined in the chain was a single strand of long dark hair. A sob, raw and guttural, tore from Sarah's throat. It was a sound of 29 years of buried grief, of a story she had never questioned, of a truth so monstrous it felt impossible. The sweet, cloying smell in the attic suddenly made sense. It wasn't perfume. It was the faint, lingering scent of the single rose that had been pressed between the pages of the letter. A final, desperate apology from a dead man. She scrambled backwards, away from the chest, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. The house was no longer just empty, it was filled with a chilling presence. The silence was no longer peaceful, it was screaming. She heard a car pull into the driveway. Headlights swept across the attic window, throwing the shrouded furniture into stark, terrifying relief. It was too early for Mark to be back. The estate agent wasn't due until morning. Her blood ran cold. She crawled to the window, her body trembling, and peered down into the driveway. A dark sedan was parked behind her car, its engine still humming. The driver's side door opened, and a figure emerged. He was old, stooped, and walked with a slight limp, leaning heavily on a cane. But even in the dim light, she recognized the silhouette. She recognized the hat. It was Sheriff Thompson. He stood there for a moment, his head tilted, as if listening. He looked up, his gaze sweeping across the front of the house, lingering for a heart-stopping moment on the attic window where she was hidden. A slow, knowing smile spread across his wrinkled face. It was not the kind smile of the man who gave candy to children. It was the smile of a predator who had scented his prey after a long, patient hunt. He knew, somehow, after all these years, he knew she had found it. The king had come to protect his castle. Sarah flattened herself against the floor, her breath catching in her throat. The letter felt like a brand in her hand. The map, a death sentence. The dust motes settled around her, no longer dancing, but clinging, like a shroud. The 29-year-old secret was out of its box, and the monster was at the door. The story had been a lie. Alara and Liam hadn't run off to chase a dream. They had been dragged into a nightmare. They were not lost lovers, they were victims. And the man responsible, the man who had built a life on their bones, was now walking up the front path to the house where the last piece of evidence, the last voice of the dead, was clutched in her terrified hand. The front doorknob began to turn. Alara, even her name was a rebellion. It sounded like a whisper of wind through the pines, a secret incantation. She was born in the shadow of her older brother, John, Sarah's father. A boy who was as solid and predictable as the granite that formed the bedrock of their small New Hampshire town. John was destined for law school, for a corner office, for a life measured in billable hours and quiet respectability. Alara, it seemed, was destined for the sky. She had her mother's raven dark hair, but her father's untamable spirit. A combination that made her both intoxicating and terrifying to the staid community of Northwood. While John read case law, Alara read poetry, her lips moving silently, her eyes seeing worlds far beyond the town line. She painted, not pretty landscapes of the local covered bridge, but raw, abstract swirls of color that felt like emotions thrown onto a canvas. Her laughter was too loud in the hushed pews of the Congregational Church. Her questions too sharp for the comfortable certainties of her teachers. To her brother, she was a constant source of anxiety, a wild variable in the carefully constructed equation of his life. To Sarah, in the fleeting years before she vanished, she was magic. Sarah remembered her aunt not as a person, but as a feeling. The scent of turpentine and cloves that clung to her clothes. The flash of a silver ring on her finger as she'd gesture wildly, telling a story. The way she'd lie in the grass with a 5-year-old Sarah, pointing out constellations not by their proper names, but by the shapes she imagined. See that one? That's the runaway teacup. And over there, the lonely dragon. She was the splash of vibrant color in their beige, sensible world. Her father, John, saw it differently. She's reckless, he'd say to Sarah's mother, his voice tight. With a mixture of anger and fear. She has no respect for how things are done. This isn't Boston. People talk. Reputations are fragile. He was a man who worshipped at the altar of reputation. His own was impeccable. John Calloway, the sharpest lawyer in the county, a man of his word, a pillar of the community. Elara was a crack in that pillar. She was a constant, public reminder that not all Callaways were cut from the same sensible cloth. His love for her was tangled with a deep, resentful sense of responsibility, as if her wildness was a personal failing on his part, a stain he was constantly trying to scrub out. Then came Liam. Liam O'Connell was the town's beautiful tragedy. His father had been a mill worker, a good man with a bad liver, who died too young, leaving a wife who faded into a quiet, depressive haze, and a son who inherited his father's dark, soulful eyes, and the heavy weight of being from the wrong side of the tracks. The O'Connells lived in a small, rented house by the river, a place that smelled of damp wood and boiled cabbage. Liam was brilliant, a natural mechanic who could coax any engine back to life, a poet who kept his notebooks hidden, a boy with a mind as sharp as any lawyer's but with no path to get there. He was trapped by circumstance, his future already mapped out for him. The garage, a life of grease-stained hands and quiet resignation. He and Elara were an inevitability, a collision of two stars that had been orbiting each other for years. They met, officially, when Elara's beat-up convertible died on the side of the road, and Liam, on his way home from the garage, stopped to help. He'd leaned under the hood, his worn t-shirt pulling tight across his shoulders, and spoken to the engine with a gentle reverence she'd never seen a man show to anything but a prayer book. She'd watched him, not with the condescension of a Callaway, but with the fascination of a fellow artist recognizing a master of a different craft. When he finally coaxed the engine to a sputtering life, he'd looked up, his face smudged with grease, and given her a slow, shy smile that made her heart ache. Their love was a secret at first. A series of stolen moments in the woods, hushed conversations in his truck parked at the quarry, a world of their own built in the margins of their prescribed lives. But a secret like that couldn't stay hidden in a town like Northwood. It seeped out, a wisp of smoke under a locked door. A sighting of his truck near her house late at night. The two of them sharing a soda at the diner, their heads bent close together. Oblivious to the stares, the town's judgment was swift and merciless, and its chief arbiter was Sheriff Howard Thompson. Thompson was more than the law in Northwood. He was the town's moral compass, its gatekeeper. He was a big man, with a folksy, gap-toothed smile that he used like a shield, and cold, pale eyes that missed nothing. He had built his career on maintaining order, and to him, order meant preserving the town's rigid social hierarchy. A Callaway girl belonged with a boy from a good family, a boy with prospects. A boy like Liam O'Connell was a disruption, a threat to that order. But his interest in Elara felt more personal, more predatory. He'd known her since she was a girl. He'd stopped by the Callaway house ostensibly to talk to her father about some town business. But his gaze would linger on Elara. He'd compliment her paintings with a tone that felt less like appreciation, and more like possession. Such a talent, he'd say, his eyes roaming over her. A girl like you have to be careful. The world is full of wolves. It was a warning that sounded like a threat. He saw her not as a person, but as a prize, a beautiful, wild thing that belonged to the town, and, by extension, to him. Liam's presence was an affront, a poacher stealing what Thompson believed was his to guard, and, perhaps, to own. The pressure on Elara and Liam became suffocating. Her father's lectures grew more frequent, more desperate. "You are ruining your life, Elara. Do you have any idea what people are saying? You're making a fool of yourself, and of this family." "I love him, John," she'd say, her voice quiet but firm, a steel rod against his blustering love. He'd scoff. "What does a boy like that know of love? He knows opportunity. He sees the Callaway name, and he sees a ladder out of the gutter." It was a cruelty born of fear, the fear of a man losing control. Every whispered rumor, every disapproving glance aimed at his sister, felt like a judgment on him. His perfect reputation was being tarnished by her choices. Liam faced a different kind of torment. Thompson started harassing him, pulling him over for fabricated traffic violations, showing up at the garage to ask friendly questions about his intentions. "You're flying a little close to the sun, son," Thompson said to him one afternoon. Leaning against Liam's prized truck. "A pretty bird like that, She's not meant for a cage, and she's certainly not meant for a grease monkey. Do well to remember your place. The witness to all this, the silent, terrified observer, was Thomas Miller. The miller's farm was a place of dirt and sweat and unending work. Thomas's father was a hard man, broken by the land and by a deep-seated fear of authority. He taught his son that the world was divided into predators and prey, and their lot was to keep their heads down and pray the predators didn't notice them. Thomas was a quiet boy, a dreamer like Alara, but without her fire. He watched her from a distance, from his bedroom window that overlooked the Calloway property. He saw her painting in the fields, dancing in the rain, a creature of light and freedom he could only admire from the shadows. He was there. The day Elara's father confronted Liam in the town square. It was a Saturday. The square was bustling. John Calloway, dressed in his crisp weekend khakis, walked right up to Liam, who was coming out of the hardware store. "Stay away from my sister," John said. His voice low, but carrying in the suddenly quiet air. Liam, holding a small paper bag, just looked at him, his face pale. "That's between me and Alara." "It's between you and me," John corrected, his face flushed with anger. "She is my responsibility, and I will not have her name dragged through the mud by the likes of you." The whole town watched. They saw the confrontation, the powerful lawyer, and the boy from the river. They saw the lines being drawn. Thomas Miller, standing by the fountain, felt a cold knot of dread in his stomach. He saw the look in John Calloway's eyes, not just anger, but a desperate, pleading fear. And he saw Sheriff Thompson, standing across the square, watching the scene unfold with a look of grim satisfaction. It was as if he was watching a play he had written, the characters all moving exactly as he'd intended. The final piece of the tragedy was Ilara's mother, a woman so beaten down by her husband's ambition and her daughter's rebellion that she had retreated into a world of headaches and hushed sighs. She loved Ilara, but she was terrified of her husband, of the scandal, of the disruption. Her love was a passive, helpless thing. "Please, Ilara," she'd whisper, wringing her hands. "Just be sensible. Don't make your father angry." She was not a protector. She was another ghost in a house already filled with them. So the stage was set. The victim, a girl who loved too fiercely; the antagonist, a man who saw that love as a challenge to his power. The accomplice, a brother who valued reputation over blood. And the witness, a boy who was taught that silence was survival. They were all trapped in the web of a small town's vicious secrets. A web spun by a patient, smiling spider who wore a sheriff's badge. The night Ilara and Liam vanished was not the beginning of the story. It was the inevitable, brutal end of a chapter that had been written in whispers, threats, and fear long before. And for 29 years, the final page had remained unread, hidden in a child's chest, waiting for the dust to be disturbed. The weeks leading up to the disappearance were a slow, agonizing crescendo of cruelty. The town, taking its cue from its self-appointed leaders, turned on Ilara and Liam with a quiet, suffocating viciousness. It wasn't overt violence, not at first. It was the shunning in the grocery store, the way conversations would cease when Ilara walked into a room. It was the sudden, unexplained cancellation of a commission for one of her paintings by the town library. The librarian stammering about budget cuts while refusing to meet her eye. It was the word trash keyed into the dusty driver's side door of Liam's truck. Sheriff Thompson's campaign escalated from veiled threats to open intimidation. He began parking his cruiser at the end of the Calloway's long driveway in the evenings, a silent, uniformed sentinel. He wasn't breaking any laws, he was just there, a constant looming presence, a reminder of his power. John Calloway would peer out the window, his jaw clenched, his face a mask of impotent fury. He was a lawyer, a man of rules and statutes, but Thompson was playing a different game, one that wasn't fought in courtrooms. "He's trying to provoke me," John said one night, pacing the oriental rug in the living room. "He wants me to do something stupid, then tell him to leave." Ilara shot back, her voice raw with frustration. She was trapped in the house, the sheriff's presence a virtual house arrest, You're John Calloway. People respect you. Make him go away, respect. John laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. That man is the town Ilara. He appoints the zoning board. He gets the mayor elected. He decides who gets a liquor license and who gets audited. You think my respect means anything when he can dismantle my entire life with a few phone calls? This is the world you've dragged us into. The accusation hung in the air, thick and poisonous. He blamed her. Her love, her defiance, was not a source of pride for him, but a liability. The betrayal was a fresh wound every day. She looked at her brother, at the man who should have been her staunchest defender, and saw only a man terrified of losing his standing. He wasn't protecting her. He was protecting himself from her. Liam bore the brunt of the physical intimidation. One night, as he was closing up the garage, two of Thompson's deputies, beefy men with identical smirks, paid him a visit. They didn't arrest him, they just cornered him, their large bodies blocking the exit. Heard you're quite the mechanic, one of them said, picking up a wrench and weighing it in his hand. Be a shame if something happened to those clever hands of yours. A real shame. They stayed for an hour, asking him meaningless questions, knocking over toolboxes, their presence a calculated act of terror. Liam said nothing. He just stood there, his body rigid, his eyes burning with a hatred he couldn't show. When they finally left, he sank onto an old tire, his hands shaking, not with fear, but with a rage so profound it made him feel sick. He was being systematically broken, and there was no one he could turn to. The law was the one breaking him. The only sanctuary they had was with each other, in the stolen hours after midnight. Liam would park his truck down the road and sneak through the woods to the back of the Calloway property. Ilara would slip out her window and meet him by the old oak tree at the edge of the forest. There, in the dark, they could breathe. We have to leave, Liam said one night, his voice urgent. He held her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the curve of her cheekbones. I've been saving. It's not much, but it's enough to get us to California. We can start over. No one will know us. You can paint, I can work, we can just be us. Ilara looked at him, at his beautiful, earnest face, and her heart broke. She wanted to say yes. She wanted to run. But the thought of leaving, of letting them win, felt like a surrender. This is my home, Liam. My family is here. If we run, we're admitting we did something wrong. What's more important? He asked, his voice cracking. Your pride? Or your life, Ilara? They're not going to stop. Thompson, he's not right in the head. The way he looks at you, it's not just about the town, it's about him. He wants to own you. The conversation was overheard. Thomas Miller, unable to sleep, was sitting by his window, a silent sentinel in the neighboring darkness. He saw the two figures under the oak tree, their whispered conversation carried on the night air. He couldn't make out the words, but he could feel the desperation, the tension. He saw Liam's pleading gestures, Ilara's conflicted posture, and then he saw another shadow detach itself from the deeper darkness of the woods. A larger figure. It was Thompson. He wasn't in his uniform. He was just standing there, 20 yards away, watching them. A predator, observing its prey, learning their habits, their sanctuaries. Thomas's blood went cold. He shrank back from the window, his heart pounding. The sheriff hadn't seen him. But he had seen the sheriff. And he had seen the look on his face, a chilling, possessive hunger. The final escalation came a week before they disappeared. A package arrived for Ilara. It was a small, flat box, wrapped in plain brown paper, with no return address. Inside, nestled on a bed of cotton, was a dead sparrow, its neck broken. Tucked beneath its wing was a small, folded note. The handwriting was a crude, blocky print. Pretty birds shouldn't fly so far from their nest. Sometimes they fall. Ilara screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror that brought her mother running. John was still at the office. When he came home and saw the box, the color drained from his face. This was no longer about reputation. This was a direct, violent threat. He did what he should have done months ago. He drove straight to the sheriff's office. Thompson was sitting at his desk, cleaning his service revolver, the picture of calm authority. What is the meaning of this? John demanded, his voice shaking with rage as he threw the box onto the desk. Thompson looked inside, his expression unreadable. He poked the dead bird with the tip of a pen. "Well, John," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Looks like your sister's got an enemy. When a girl gets a reputation, well, you know how it is. Some fellas get the wrong idea. Some fellas get jealous." He looked up, his cold eyes meeting John's. "I told you she was trouble. Maybe now you'll listen. Get her under control. Keep her away from that O'Connell boy. Maybe then, her little admirers will lose interest." It was a confession, wrapped in a threat. He was telling John, in no uncertain terms, that he was the one behind it, and that he was the only one who could call it off. He was demonstrating the totality of his power. John Calloway, the respected lawyer, stood there, utterly helpless. The law was a weapon, and it was pointed directly at his family's heart. He drove home in a daze. The fight that night was the worst yet. "We're leaving," Alara said, her face pale but resolute. Liam had been right. This was no longer about pride. "Liam and I are leaving tonight." "No," John said, his voice flat. "You're not going anywhere with him. You can't stop me." "Oh, can't I?" The fear in him had finally curdled into something ugly, something authoritarian. He was channeling the very man he despised. "You are my sister. You are under my roof. You will do as I say. It's over with him. For your own good." "For my good," she cried, her voice filled with disbelief and betrayal. "Or for yours. So you can sleep at night, knowing your reputation is safe. He's going to kill us, John, don't you see that?" "He's not going to kill anyone," John said, though his own words sounded hollow. "He's just trying to scare you. If you break it off with Liam, it will all go away." It was the ultimate betrayal. He was asking her to sacrifice her love, her future, to appease the monster. He was choosing the path of least resistance, the path that protected him, not her. She looked at her brother, at the stranger he had become. The love and admiration she once had for him withered and died in that moment. "I hate you," she whispered, the words like ice. "You are a coward." She turned and ran to her room, slamming and locking the door. John stood in the hallway, his sister's words echoing in the silence. He had made his choice. He had sided with order, with the path of least resistance. He had sided with Sheriff Thompson. He told himself it was to protect her, to de-escalate the situation. But deep down, in a place he would never admit to, he knew he was just protecting himself. Later that night, Ilara slipped out of her window for the last time. She was not running away with her lover to chase a dream. She was running for her life. But the monster was waiting. And her brother, the man who should have been her savior, had just locked the door behind her. The twist didn't come from a dusty attic. It came from the cold, sterile heart of a server farm 1,000 miles away. For 29 years, the truth had been buried under 6 feet of earth and a mountain of lies. The letter from Thomas Miller was the key, the map that pointed to the grave. But the lock it opened was not just on a forgotten plot of land. It was on a digital tomb that no one even knew existed. After finding the letter, Sarah didn't scream. She didn't run. A strange, glacial calm settled over her. The terror was still there, a humming wire beneath her skin, but it was overlaid with a cold, clear rage. Sheriff Thompson was downstairs. He was old, he was slow, but he was still the king, and he had come to ensure his reign remained absolute. She was trapped. But he had made a mistake. He had underestimated her. He saw her as John Calloway's daughter, a quiet, grieving woman. He did not see the sliver of Alara that lived within her, the spark of defiance she had inherited from the aunt she barely knew. She heard him moving around downstairs, the tap-tap-tap of his cane on the hardwood floors. A predator searching. She knew she had only minutes. She took out her phone, her fingers surprisingly steady. She took a photo of the letter, page by page. She took a photo of the hand-drawn map. Then she did something that would change everything. She remembered a story her father had told her once, a rare moment of nostalgic candor. He was talking about his first computer, an expensive, cumbersome machine he'd bought in the early 90s. "Your aunt," he'd said, with a sad shake of his head. Elara was fascinated by it. Before she left, she said it was the future. A way to connect with the world beyond this town. She was teaching herself how to use it. Email, bulletin boards, all of it. She was fearless with technology, always was. An idea, wild and desperate, sparked in her mind. Elara was smart. She was a fighter. She wouldn't have just let herself be erased. Sarah crawled over to a stack of old boxes labeled J. Calloway. Office. Her father had been meticulous. He never threw anything away. She tore through them, searching for anything related to that old computer. At the bottom of a box filled with tax records, she found it, a small case of floppy disks. Most were labeled case files or finances, but one, a single black disk, had a small handwritten label in Elara's looping script. It just said, "My anchor." The tapping of the cane was on the stairs now. He was coming up. Her heart hammered. She had no way to read a floppy disk. It was an artifact from a dead era. But she had the photos of the letter. That was the priority. She opened her email, attached the images, and sent them to her work address, to her brother, and to the state police headquarters. With the subject line, "Evidence, Murder of Elara Calloway and Liam O'Connell. Sheriff Howard Thompson." She hit send just as the attic ladder began to creak. She shoved the floppy disk into her pocket, stuffed the original letter and map back into the chest, and pushed it deep into the corner. Behind the shrouded armchair, she wiped her face, tried to compose her features into a mask of weary grief. The old man's head appeared at the top of the ladder. He pulled himself up, his movements slow and labored, but his eyes were sharp, predatory. "Sarah, my dear," Sheriff Thompson said, his voice a gravelly paternal purr. "I heard about your mother. My deepest condolences. I was just in the neighborhood and saw the lights on. Thought I'd stop by and see if you needed anything." The lie was so bold, so audacious, it was almost brilliant. That's very kind of you, Sheriff," Sarah stammered, playing the part. "I'm just clearing out the last of it." His eyes scanned the attic, missing nothing. They lingered on the spot where the chest had been. "This old attic," he mused, tapping his cane, "holds a lot of memories, I'll bet. Your father, he spent a lot of time up here." He took a step closer. "Find any old treasures?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. "Just junk," Sarah said, her voice shaking just enough to be convincing. "Old toys, sad memories." He smiled, a cold, thin-lipped expression. Sad memories have a way of festering. Sometimes it's best to let them stay buried. He took another step. He was between her and the ladder now. "I'd be happy to help you. There are some things a young woman shouldn't have to deal with alone." The threat was clear. He was here for the letter. He thought she had it on her. He was going to take it, and then he was going to silence her, just as he had silenced Elara. But as he moved toward her, a phone buzzed. It was his. He pulled it from his pocket, his eyes never leaving hers. He looked at the screen. The color drained from his face, his folksy mask crumbled, revealing the monster beneath. It was a text from one of his contacts, a dispatcher at the county office. It must have been an alert. An email from a Calloway, sent to the state police. His head snapped up, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and pure fury. "What did you do?" he snarled. The paternal act gone, his voice a venomous hiss. At that exact moment, two things happened. The wail of distant sirens cut through the night air, growing steadily closer, and Sarah's brother, Mark, burst into the attic, his face white with shock and terror, his own phone in his hand. "Sarah, I got your email. What the hell is going on?" Thompson was trapped. The king was cornered in his castle. He looked from Sarah to Mark, then to the approaching sirens. The hunt was over. For a moment, a look of utter defeat crossed his face. Then, it was replaced by a lifetime of pure, unadulterated evil. He lunged, not at Sarah, but at the window. With a strength born of desperation, he used his cane to shatter the glass, and before either of them could react, he climbed onto the sill. He gave Sarah one last look, a look of pure hatred. "You should have let it lie," he spat, and then he jumped. The aftermath was a maelstrom. The state police descended on the house, which was now a crime scene. Thompson hadn't died. The fall from the second-story window had been broken by a large azalea bush. But he was badly injured, his leg shattered, his rein over. He lay on the lawn, groaning, as he was handcuffed to a stretcher. The letter provided the probable cause. The map led a forensics team to the spot deep in the woods behind the old quarry. It took them 2 days of careful digging, but they found them. 2 skeletons, buried together in a shallow, unmarked grave. The forensic anthropologist confirmed the female skeleton had a fractured skull, consistent with a fatal blow to the head. The male had a single bullet hole in his chest. They had been murdered, just as Thomas Miller had said. But the case wasn't a slam dunk. Thompson, even from his hospital bed, was a formidable opponent. He hired the best defense attorney in the state. His lawyer claimed the letter was a fabrication, the ramblings of a dead, mentally unstable man. He claimed John Calloway had a grudge against Thompson. He painted the sheriff as a victim of a long-running family vendetta. The town, conditioned by decades of loyalty and fear, was divided. Many refused to believe it. The pillar of their community couldn't be a monster. The trial became a media circus. The whole state was watching. And the prosecution's case, resting on a 29-year-old letter from a dead man, felt shaky. That's when Sarah remembered the floppy disk. "My anchor," she gave it to the lead detective on the case. "I don't know what's on it," she said, "but my aunt labeled it. It has to mean something." The state police's cybercrimes unit had to dig an ancient computer out of storage to read the disk. What they found was Ellera's final, brilliant act of defiance. It wasn't a diary. It was a digital breadcrumb. On the disk was a single simple text file. It contained a username Stargazer73 and a string of what looked like gibberish, L1AM. The detectives were stumped. But a young tech-savvy analyst on the team recognized the username format. It was from an early, long-defunct internet service provider called Starlink Communications. It had been a primitive version of cloud storage, a place to back up files online. The company had been bought out in the late 90s. Its servers acquired the data thought to be long gone, but it wasn't. The analyst, through a series of brilliant digital excavations, tracked the data. The original servers had been wiped, but per the company's policy at the time, backups had been made on magnetic tapes. Those tapes, through a series of corporate mergers, had ended up in a climate-controlled storage facility in Utah. Mislabeled and forgotten for decades. It took a court order and a week of painstaking work, but they found it. They restored the data from the tape associated with the Starlink archives, and on that tape, under the username Stargazer73, they found a single, password-protected encrypted file. The password, of course, was L1AM Northstar. The file was a scan. A high-resolution scan of a handwritten journal. Ellera's journal. For the last 6 months of her life, she had been documenting everything. Thompson's harassment, the threats, her brother's cowardice, her mother's helplessness. She detailed every car that followed her, every whispered threat, every dead bird. She wrote about her fear, but also her love for Liam, and their plan to escape. The final entry was dated the afternoon of the day she disappeared. "John has forbidden me from seeing Liam. He has sided with the monster. He thinks he can control me, that he can lock me away to save his own skin. He doesn't understand. You can't cage a star. Liam is coming for me tonight. We're leaving. We're finally getting out. I am uploading this now, my anchor to the truth, just in case. If something happens to us, if we don't make it, I want the world to know why." It wasn't a runaway love story. It was an execution. And the executioner's name is Sheriff Howard Thompson. It was a voice from the grave, a digital ghost that had waited patiently for 3 decades. The conspiracy was laid bare. It wasn't just Thompson. It was the system of fear he had created, a system that had enabled him, protected him, and made men like John Calloway complicit through their silence and self-preservation. The stakes were no longer about one family's pain. They were about the soul of a town that had let a monster wear a crown for 30 years. The full, explosive truth was finally out, and it was going to burn everything to the ground. The courtroom was a tinderbox. Every seat was filled. The air was thick with the oppressive humidity of a New Hampshire summer, and the palpable tension of a story that had captivated the nation. This was no longer just a local murder trial, it was a reckoning. Howard Thompson, diminished and sallow in a wheelchair, his leg in a cast, looked less like a king and more like a petty, withered tyrant. But his eyes, when they fixed on Sarah Calloway as she took the stand, still held a flicker of that old, venomous power. Sarah was the prosecution's star witness. She spoke in a clear, steady voice, recounting the discovery in the attic, the letter, the terror of that night. Thompson's lawyer, a slick Boston attorney named Peterson, tried to paint her as an unstable, grieving daughter, projecting her family's old resentments onto his client, Ms. Calloway. Peterson began his cross-examination, his voice oozing with condescending sympathy. "You admit you never liked Sheriff Thompson, isn't that right? That your family, particularly your father, had disagreements with him over the years?" "My father had disagreements with a lot of people," Sarah replied coolly. "He was a lawyer, it was his job, but this was personal, wasn't it? He disapproved of your aunt's lifestyle." A lifestyle Sheriff Thompson, as the chief law enforcement officer, also had concerns about. "My aunt's lifestyle," Sarah said, her voice dropping, silencing the murmurs in the gallery, "was falling in love with a good man that men like you and Sheriff Thompson deemed beneath her. Her lifestyle was wanting to be free." The prosecutor, a sharp, determined woman named Maria Flores, had saved her bombshell for the end of Sarah's testimony. "Your Honor," Flores announced, her voice ringing with authority, "the state would like to introduce into evidence the contents of a digital file recovered by the State Police Cybercrimes Unit, a file created by Elara Calloway on the day of her murder." Peterson shot to his feet. "Objection, Foundation, this is absurd. A so-called digital ghost from a defunct company. This is technological trickery, not evidence." The judge, a stern, no-nonsense woman who had been watching the proceedings with an eagle eye, overruled him. The foundation had been meticulously laid by the testimony of the tech analyst. The courtroom was silent as a large screen flickered to life. And then, there it was. Ilara's handwriting, bold and alive, filled the screen. Page after page of her journal, a narrative of the slow, creeping terror that had consumed her final months. Flores had Sarah read the final, chilling entry aloud. As Sarah's voice read Ilara's last words, a wave of shock and revulsion rippled through the courtroom. The words hung in the air, an undeniable testament from beyond the grave. It wasn't a runaway love story, it was an execution. And the executioner's name is Sheriff Howard Thompson. Thompson, in his wheelchair, seemed to shrink. The color drained from his face. He stared at the screen as if seeing a ghost. But the cinematic payoff, the moment that would be replayed on news channels for years to come, was not Thompson's reaction. It was John Calloway's. He had been sitting in the front row, a ghost himself, his face a grey mask of shame. Throughout the trial, he had been silent, a man hollowed out by a guilt he had carried for 30 years. He had not been charged. His sin was one of moral cowardice, not criminal conspiracy, but his public disgrace was absolute. As Sarah finished reading, a choked sob escaped his lips. It was a sound of such profound, gut-wrenching agony that it seemed to tear through the very fabric of the courtroom. He stood up, his body trembling, his eyes fixed on the screen, on his sister's words. "It's true," he whispered, his voice hoarse. Then, louder, for the whole court to hear, "It's all true." Peterson rushed toward him. "Mr. Calloway, sit down. You are not on trial here." But John was unreachable, lost in a torrent of guilt. "I could have stopped him," he cried out, his voice breaking, tears streaming down his face. He turned, not to the judge, but to the jury, to the packed gallery, to the world. She came to me. She begged me for help. She told me he was a monster, and I didn't listen. I told her to be sensible. I told her to break it off with Liam. I was worried about my career, my reputation, my God. My reputation. He choked on the word, as if it were poison. He pointed a trembling finger at the man in the wheelchair. He knew I was a coward. He counted on it. He knew I would protect myself before I protected her. He used my weakness to corner her, to trap her. It was a confession more powerful than any piece of evidence. It was the final missing piece of the puzzle, the motive, the opportunity, the cover-up, all laid bare by the man whose silence had made it possible. The courtroom erupted. The judge hammered her gavel, but the sound was lost in the raw, explosive catharsis of the moment. John Calloway collapsed back into his seat, his body racked with sobs. A broken man, finally, publicly, admitting his damnation. The jury was out for less than an hour. The verdict was a formality, guilty, on 2 counts of first-degree murder. As they wheeled a stone-faced Howard Thompson out of the courtroom, his eyes met Sarah's one last time. There was no remorse in them, only a cold, bottomless hatred. The hatred of a king whose castle had been brought down by the ghost of a girl he thought he had silenced forever. The public justice was served. The monster was caged. But the exposure was the true victory. The story of Alara and Liam was no longer a sad, whispered rumor. It was a national headline, a cautionary tale of how evil can flourish in the soil of fear and silence. Sarah walked out of the courthouse into the glare of the cameras, not with triumph, but with a profound, aching sadness. She hadn't just exposed a murderer, she had exposed the rot in her own family, in her own town. She had won. But she had lost her father all over again, not to death, but to the truth. The cinematic moment was over. The shouting, the crying, the verdict was all just noise. The silence that followed, the silence of the grave, was the only thing that felt real. The snow fell in thick, silent flakes, blanketing the Northwood Cemetery in a shroud of pure white. It was a quiet, clean slate, a temporary absolution for the scenes buried beneath. Sarah stood before 2 new headstones, their granite edges sharp and dark. Against the snow, Alara Calloway, beloved sister and aunt, daughter of the stars, Liam O'Connell, a gentle soul, loyal and true. They were finally together in a way they never could be in life. The trial had ended 6 months ago. Howard Thompson had died in prison while awaiting appeal. His heart finally giving out, a quiet, anticlimactic end for a man whose life had caused so much noise. The town was slowly, painfully, trying to heal. A new sheriff was in place, a young woman from outside the county, and the old guard that Thompson had protected for so long had quietly resigned or been voted out. The story had forced a reckoning, a painful lancing of a wound that had festered for a generation. Sarah's brother, Mark, stood beside her, his gloved hand resting gently on her shoulder. Their relationship was different now, forged in the fire of the trial. The old, unspoken burdens had been burned away, replaced by a shared, quiet grief. Her father was not with them. After his public breakdown in the courtroom, John Calloway had become a recluse. He sold his practice, sold the family home, and moved into a small assisted living apartment on the other side of the state. He and Sarah spoke on the phone sometimes, their conversations stilted and full of painful silences. He was a man haunted by the ghost of the sister he had failed, and the daughter who had exposed him. The love was still there, a deep, wounded thing, but it was buried under too much rubble to ever be fully excavated. He had sent a single perfect white rose to be placed on Elara's grave, a silent, inadequate apology. Sarah reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the small, tarnished silver locket. The police had returned it to her from the evidence locker. She had polished it until it shone, and had new, clear pictures put inside. Alara, vibrant and smiling. Liam, his eyes full of gentle hope. She hung it carefully on the corner of Eli's headstone, the silver chain glinting against the dark stone. "Do you think she knows?" Mark asked, his voice barely a whisper against the falling snow. "That we know the truth? That they're not seen as what they said they were?" "Think," Sarah said, her eyes on the locket as it twisted gently in the breeze, "that the truth was never for them. They knew who they were. The truth was for us. For everyone who let the lie stand." She thought of Thomas Miller, the boy who had lived and died with his terrible secret. His family had moved away after the story broke, unable to bear the shame and the sudden, harsh spotlight. But, in his own way, he had been the story's unlikely hero. His cowardice had preserved the truth, keeping it safe in that chest until a time when the world was ready to hear it. His letter was a tragedy, but it was also a prayer, and it had finally been answered. As they stood there, a car pulled up on the narrow cemetery road. An elderly woman got out, moving slowly and carefully on the snowy path. She was frail, with white hair and the same dark, soulful eyes Sarah had seen in Liam's photograph. It was Liam's mother, Maeve O'Connell. She had been a ghost for 30 years, a quiet, broken woman who had accepted the town's cruel narrative of her son. The trial had brought her back to life, giving her not just grief, but rage, and finally, a fierce, protective pride. She approached the graves, holding a small bouquet of winter wildflowers. She nodded to Sarah and Mark, a look of shared, quiet understanding passing between them. She knelt, with some difficulty, and placed the flowers at the base of her son's headstone. "He was a good boy," she said, her voice thin but clear, her gaze fixed on the name carved in the stone. "He would have loved her his whole life. He would have treated her like a queen." It was a simple statement, but it was a final, powerful reclamation of the truth. Liam wasn't a kidnapper from the wrong side of the tracks. He was a good boy who had loved a girl. It was the epitaph the town had denied him for so long. The three of them stood there for a long time. Three strangers bound together by a shared history of loss, and a truth that had come at an unbearable cost. There was no grand sense of victory. No feeling of closure. The wound was too deep, the years of injustice too long. There was only a profound, haunting sadness, a quiet acknowledgement of the lives that had been destroyed, the love that had been stolen, and the silence that had cost them everything. As Sarah finally turned to leave, her gaze fell upon her own reflection, faint and distorted in the polished granite of Alara's headstone. She saw her own eyes, but for a fleeting moment, she saw her aunt's defiance in them too. The cost of the truth had been immense, but the cost of silence would have been her soul. She had not just unearthed a grave, she had unearthed a part of herself she never knew existed. The ghost of Elara Calloway was finally at peace, but her echo, that untamable spark of rebellion, would live on, a lingering, bittersweet reminder that some voices can never truly be silenced. The snow continued to fall, covering their footprints, leaving the three headstones Alara, Liam, and the locket that bound them to stand as silent, eternal witnesses.